city to Lee Burbridge. So we really appreciate everybody who's come to multiple of these lectures. This is the final lecture in our May series, Pirate Month, at the Powder Magazine. One of the reasons I kind of picked May was kind of thinking about Blackbeard showing up in Charleston in either late May or early June. There's a little bit, I get a little bit of both dates depending on which calendar is used.
Exactly.
But I think for the current calendar, if we go by the modern calendar, I think it's like either today or yesterday or something. So we're really close with this lecture. Got some more people coming in. So we are extremely delighted tonight to have Dr. Linda Carnes-McNaughton join us, and she's gonna kind of give us the lowdown on a project that she's worked on for about 20 years, which is the Queen Anne's Revenge project. She's been in professional archaeology for over 40 years as an archaeologist, researcher, and a cultural resources manager. She's primarily specialized in cultural materials studies. So from terrestrial sites, which are land archaeology sites, to underwater sites. She has an undergraduate degree from Georgia State University. She has graduate degrees from the University of Tennessee. She earned her doctoral degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And her dissertation focused on North Carolina's 19th century earthenware and stoneware pottery. And I think from what I understand, Linda's sort of first connection with the Queen Anne's Revenge was really kind of identifying pottery. And then it kind of ballooned into all sorts of other materials that were coming up from that project, and kind of getting involved for all of that. Now her day job is as a cultural resources program for Fort Bragg. She's the curator and program archaeologist at Fort Bragg's Cultural Resources program. And she's obviously got a interest in global pottery found, at the wreck site. And she's been drafting different papers along with her co-author, Mark Wild Ramsing. She and he co-authored several articles, and also their book from 2018, which is called Blackbeard, Sunken Prize, The 300-Year Voyage of Queen Anne's Revenge. And it's published by UNC Press. It's right there. It's a bargain at $28. I'm going to be getting some for the Powder Magazine gift shop for sure. And so she has been, like I said, on this project for over 2 decades, and just brings a huge amount of knowledge and experience for us tonight. So listen closely, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot, Linda. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll just let you roll.
Thank you, Catherine. Wow. Okay, so I feel so introduced now. You know everything. But I would like to shout out to my co-author, Mark Wild Ramsing. You'll see a picture of him in a moment, but that would be his lovely mugshot there. And I should qualify that Mark is a retired underwater archaeologist and was the project director for a long time. And so I affectionately refer to him as a bubblehead, and he affectionately refers to me as a jughead, because as Catherine stated, when I worked for State Historic Sites in the 90s, that's when this shipwreck was found. And so my colleagues would come up to Raleigh to the home office, bringing, small parts, artifacts from the shipwreck. And the bait really was the ceramics. I mean, they baited me, I got hooked, and they reeled me in for 20 years of volunteering on this project. And I've not regretted a moment of it. So about 2015, Mark and I, he was retired, and I was already working for Club Fed at the time down at Fort Bragg. But we had previously collaborated on a couple of other books and articles. There's one in this book called Pieces of Eight, and Catherine will send these references out to you. And that particular article focused primarily on establishing in a solid way that this was a French vessel. This was a French shipwreck. We removed, with Mark's dissertation and the follow-up, we removed all doubt that this was La Concorde, stolen ship named Queen Anne's Revenge. So a lot of what I'll talk about tonight is not so much Blackbeard, but this ship and the artifacts recovered from it. So after Mark and I did that, then in 2015, we were again looking onto the horizon and realized that in 2018, this would be the 300th anniversary of the shipwreck itself. So we targeted 2018 for the publication of the book, and UNC Press welcomed us, and that was just a wonderful experience. So most of what I'm going to show you, not all of it, but most of what I'm going to show you tonight deals with, as I said, the discovery of the shipwreck, the recovery of the shipwreck, and analysis of at least 60% of the artifacts so far. So it is still a work in progress. There, of course, it's a state-funded project. There is established a QAR conservation laboratory outside of ECU in Greenville, North Carolina. And then the museum that basically receives most of the stabilized artifacts is in Beaufort, North Carolina, and that's the Maritime History Museum. But many of the artifacts are in other museums as well. There are many opportunities to see stabilized artifacts from this site. So, of course, we have to talk about Blackbeard before we get to the shipwreck. So, as I had promised a couple of weeks ago, I'm going to give you not only a genealogy, but I'm going to give you a baby picture. Maybe I am. Oh dear, it froze up on me. Okay, hold on. There we go. There we go. All right. So maybe you can see most of that. This is Blackbeard's baby picture that I found online. You might have seen that before. But there has been some considerable scholarship research on the background of Edward Teach. And it's a rather circuitous path how it comes to be known, but it devolves to, as I'll come to her, Lucretia Ethel, who essentially was his stepmother and was fairly wealthy and owned land on Jamaica. And so she was his dad's second wife. But we're going to back up the story to the beginning, that his parents, Edward Teach's, oh, maybe I should mention that too, Teach. So I always say Teach. Just think of the THA as the way it was pronounced in that period of England. Just think of the Thames River as THAMES, and it's pronounced the Thames River. So Edward Teach is pronounced Teach in that way. So his grandparents were a Reverend Thomas Teach, and there are his birth and death dates, and his wife Rachel, who records indicate died in 1705. They lived in a small community called Stonehouse, which is near Sapperton in Gloucestershire, England. Reverend Thomas and Rachel had 8 children, and his third son was also Edward Teach. Now, he became a mariner, and so he's also known as a Captain Edward Teach. So the next generation you're looking at is Captain Edward Teach, and he's born in 1659 in Stonehouse. And unfortunately, our pictures kind of obscure that just a tad. I don't know if I can move that over, Catherine, but that's okay. So we know that he was born, and when he died, his first wife, whom he married in Bristol in England, her name was Elizabeth. And we see that she died in January of 1699. He then travels around, and he ends up going to Jamaica, and he marries Lucretia Ethel. just 6 months later, also in 1699. So from Edward and Elizabeth's union, that marriage, they produced 2 children. So here's Captain Teach. He's widowed and he has 2 small children to raise. Those 2 children are a daughter named Elizabeth and a son named Edward. This would be our Edward. This would be our Teach. So those are the 2 children, brother and sister, Edward and Elizabeth, from that union. By the time he marries Lucretia, who had already previously been married, they have 3 additional children from that union. So together, Lucretia and Captain Edward Teach, his father, they are in Jamaica. They live in Yago Town, also called Spanish Town. And during those periods of 1683 to 1685. So again, looking at the 2 children from the first union of Edward and Elizabeth, it's very common to keep passing down these generational names. So we know that Edward Teach's sister married Elizabeth. She married John Valacius in 1707. We also know, and we see number 2 there, that Edward Blackbeard Teach, I doubt many people called him Junior, actually, but Edward Teach Blackbeard, born in 1683, and likely in Bristol, which is where his father and grandparents lived. And we know specifically when he died, which is 22nd of November. You can see it, 1718. He did marry, he had 1 daughter. And again, as legacy has it, named it for his sister and for his mother. There are no other records of his wife at that time other than this daughter. And the records about his daughter show up at the age of 18. She married Dr. Henry Barnum in June of 1720 in England. And I think Edward Barnum is the one that goes on to work for Sloan, who helps to establish the Natural History Museum in Britain. We also know from these early records that Edward Teach Jr. served in the Royal Navy on the HMS Windsor. So he was in the Queen's service. He was a mariner like his father. He was very familiar with the sea. And for the Queen, as we know, he was a privateer, raiding other ships with, his letter of marque and permission to do so. And he was, after he got out of the Navy, he was a privateer for several years, moving in circles with other privateers. And then, as we also know, all that changes when the Queen dies in 1740, and what had been semi-legal then becomes illegal. So another thing about his commission with the Royal Navy, there was information that he was promoted a rank and that he had a proclivity for mathematics. And I'll explain that later when we get to some of these pieces of equipment that we found. All right, so as I said, our big character here tonight is really this ship. Who on this ship? What did it look like? Where did it come from? And we know where it ended up. So this is our big character for tonight. This is a sketch of the 3-masted La Concorde de Nantes. It was renamed by Blackbeard, as we know, Queen Anne's Revenge, for only 8 months that he used it. But this was a large frigate-sized 250, 300-ton ship. It was built in Nantes in France, which was major shipbuilding yard, particularly for the slave industry. We know from records that René Martendois is who owned this particular ship. And we know all of that from court records later, where he is, demanding to know how the ship got stolen, how can he get his money back? And, he and the captain have some discussions that transpire into court records. So we know that he owned several ships, engaged in privateering and then the slave trade. So this is an artist's rendering of that. And I think we've touched on this several times in previous lectures in this series, that Catherine has compiled. This is, of course, the classic triangle of trade. This is coincident with the golden age of piracy. In fact, these travel corridors were predictable avenues where ships were stolen because they knew the same routes they would be coming. But moving goods east and west, moving goods, of course, out of England, manufacturing goods going to the west coast of Africa, and then the picking up other, gold, ivory, spices, hardwoods, but also slaves, enslaved Africans, and then trading them, moving them along the Middle Passage into the Caribbean and into the Americas. And we know this is a trade that went on for almost 2 centuries. So this is sort of moving then goods from America back to England. So this is how it gets the name, the Triangle of Trade. And there's just some excellent scholarship and research on all of the aspects of this about what went east and what went west. All right, so exploring the conditions of this particular slave vessel, we know that when this ship left Nantes, well, I'll come back to the dates on that, but it was carrying slaves towards the end of this 1717 voyage. And so this is just a capture. It's by a French artist from the 1800s called Transport des Nègres dans la Colonie. So it shows you how the men were segregated from the women, and with this barricado across, a barricade across the deck side. And this is when they were allowed out of the hold. Most of the time they were kept in the hold of the ship, but brought out for cooking, for inspection, for, as they say, entertainment, or, just sort of assessing condition, or for labor as well related to the ship. So it kind of gives you that idea of the crowded conditions. All right, now this is the one I wanted to touch on a little bit more detail. As I said, we are fairly certain that this ship was built in the shipyards just above Nantes, and that it sailed, its first sail was, as you can see on the bottom left, it sailed in 1710. And it sailed in 1710 on its primary voyage as a privateer. I think we do know who the captain was at that time, but the captains did change. We know specifically who the captain was on the last voyage. So this was, again, moving to the west coast of Africa, and then to the Caribbean and to the Americas, and then back to Europe. By 1713, and each of these trips takes a couple of years. It's to unload and offload and then move everything, keeping the winds in the sails. By 1713, the first voyage is now as a slave voyage in the slave trade. So in several other reference that we have, and I'll pass this one on to Catherine also, we call it the ship with 2 names, because it was not only a slave ship, a privateer ship, then a slave ship. It eventually was the flagship of a pirate. So by 1713, it's now a slave trade ship. By 1715, it's on its 3rd voyage in this triangle of trade. And then by 1717, and again, these travel corridors were predictable avenues. Pirates could sort of lay wait, and with some degree of expectation, just lay in wait for, a prize to come over the horizon, and then basically charge it. So 1717, the ship leaves with a crew of 75 Frenchmen. We know their names of the Frenchmen who were leaving, basically where they're from. We know who the surgeons were. We'll come back to that, who the pilot, who the cook, who the carpenters, who the gunsmiths. We know who the captain, who the lieutenant was, who the quartermaster was. So we have all of these names of these people. And they come then into West Africa. And when they spend some time there and leave West Africa on the Middle Passage, they have in the cargo 516 enslaved Africans. And then they head the Middle Passage. Well, what happens then is that during the Middle Passage, and probably a little prior to that, probably when they were in Africa, the crew is greatly depleted by disease. And as the time they're kind of concluding the Middle Passage, they've lost 17 crew member to death and a variety of deaths, diseases. And they've lost almost 150 slaves to disease. And so they have only 36 crew member who can steer this giant, kind of big ship. I won't say giant, big ship, bigger than most. And of those, only about 21 of them were actually able to maneuver the ship. So his Blackbeard is laying in wait, and he's actually, he has a small flotilla of 2 to 3 ships now. He is looking for a flagship. He is looking for a larger ship that is fast and has a lot of cargo space and can be equipped with more cannon. That was a priority for him. So he captures this ship on November 17th of 1717. So that's the capturing of the La Concorde. What happens in this period? They negotiate offloading those slaves that are still alive and in the holds, is about 375 or so. They go to a smaller island. Captain Dusset is allowed to offload those slaves. And while all of this is happening on the small island of Bikia, and then these slaves are transported to Martinique, Blackbeard is prepping this ship to take it. And he gives a smaller sloop to Captain Dorset, the French captain, which they rename something like Unfortunate Encounter, on this event. So that's the smaller sloop for them. And they are able to sell some of the slaves. He keeps 145 of the slaves on the ship with him. And he also kidnaps 14 Frenchmen. Well, let me qualify that. He kidnaps 10 Frenchmen and 4 Frenchmen volunteer. So he has 14 of the original French crew on the ship with him now, plus 145 slaves, and then his own crew on this big flagship. And of those particular people that he kidnapped from the crew, specifically the 3 medical surgeons, gunsmith, the baker or the cook, excuse me, the pilot of the ship, which makes a lot of sense, some carpenters, and then some other general craftsmen that he takes with him. So he knows what he's got to do. He knows this is a big ship, and he needed the pilot. Obviously, if you're going to, hijack a plane, you're going to take the pilot. So he's going to also take the pilot. So they are now incorporated into his crew on the boat he renames the Queen Anne's Revenge. Now, Catherine, can you see the date at the top of that? I'm blocked a little bit.
I think it says mid-May.
Yeah, mid-May. All right. Well, there, we're hedging our bet there. Okay. So, of course, he has this ship, and between November and this episode, he is up and down the coast, and he is raiding other ships and stealing other prizes, keeping the Queen Anne's Revenge, what he's renamed, keeping this large ship as his flagship, and then his 2 to 3 other vessels. He has, a crew of probably 350 now. So one of his bold moves, which is, I guess, part of the central theme of this lecture series, is the things that happen in Charlestown. And so Blackbeard and his crew, they come into the harbor. They hold the Charleston harbor basically hostage. They block it and hold every other ship in there hostage, not letting them pass to come or go. And he, for several days, he sends a smaller sloop to town to basically get a chest of medicine. And I believe the first speaker touched on that. He implied it was mercury. It was likely more than that. And all of this circles back to the research, of course, that's in the book, and another publication that's called Mariner's Maladies that's in this book. And this is an exploration of the period diseases at the time, the equipment that we found, and also sort of hypothesis of what the expendables were. But more importantly, it also outlines the contract that the surgeons, when they leave Nantes, that ship surgeons sign a contract that's binding between the captain, the owner of the ship, and the surgeons themselves. And the surgeons are responsible for bringing their own capital tools. So that's why we can explain why most of the equipment, medical equipment, is French. And then they have to pass like a board, an apothecary board, to be put on there. But there's also a clause in there that the captain of the ship is responsible for the expendables. So the captain is responsible for replenishing the medicine chest. And by now, believe me, they needed replenishing with all these people dying in the medicine. But moreover, there are fines limited. So if the surgeon or the captain or the owner break the agreements of this contract, there are fines to be rendered. So one of them was the surgeon cannot leave the ship. So it kind of gives a little bit of flavor on whether or not he actually kidnapped them, or they realize that under contract they can't leave the La Concorde because they are assigned to that ship or they will be fined. Now later, of course, they don't have a choice. So the other things going on, of course, as pirates would do, they're taking hostages and stealing clothing and jewelry, gold and silver coins, anybody coming through that area. So they get their medicine, and then they leave not long after that. That was May. And the ship is in kind of bad way. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be keel hauled, and the hull needs cleaning. It needs patching. It's large. It's got issues, and it needs to go into some safe port for this, workshop to happen. So again, that's why we say on or about June 10th, depending on the calendar that you refer to, they make an approach into Beaufort Inlet. Now, what is in Beaufort Inlet is a tiny little town called Fishtown that was actually started in about 1704. It's maybe got a dozen buildings, but it's safe, and it's within the barrier islands. And Blackbeard rightly figures he can get in there, get the ship clean, get it patched, and take a little time off from this ongoing raiding. And by now, he also knows that he's a hunted man. He knows that there is a bounty on his head. So as they approach Beaufort Inlet, I'm going to say Beaufort and Beaufort, y'all forgive me. I'm going to say the North Carolina for the South Carolina, Beaufort Inlet. One ship already goes through, and it was a lighter weight ship, and it goes on through and makes it through this narrow channel. Well, they waited till high tide, and then they're trying to steer this ship through this barrier. And of course, it becomes, wedged into this sandbar and gets stuck pretty fast, pretty solid. The other ship that went through kind of came back, and they issued a kedge anchor to try to pull it off the sandbar. That too was unsuccessful. So we've got several hours elapsing here. The ship is not budging off of this sandbar. And of course, Blackbeard is realizing this is a great opportunity to do some corporate downsizing. And so he takes one of the smaller sloops, and he takes 40 white men, 60 black men is the description. And he takes pretty much, according to court records, pretty much all of the booty that was worth taking that they had gathered from all of these other prizes. And he takes all the valuables that he could take with him, and he flees the scene. And so he is hijacking and taking off. Well, The other people on board, and now we have probably, it's still the 300 and something crewmen, they're either jumping off or getting off onto longboats with clothes on their back, what's portable, what they can take, what they can unfasten and take. And then those poor souls that kind of had no choice of what they could take, they're just also getting off and swimming to shore, swimming to the town. There's a lot of, description about what we think actually is going on. So from the time that someone is, echoing abandoned ship, this is going to go over. We're not going to be able to salvage anything else. Decisions are made and different people make decisions. So crew members are making decisions. Those who are enslaved are probably just trying to get off with their life, those still on there, and of course the French crewmen. So all of that factors back into the artifact assemblage that we find on this shipwreck. You have to think about it, it's a slow wrecking event. And there's nobody, no souls are lost, no one died. And that's, also, verified by court records and eyewitness accounts. Everybody got off this ship. Now, not everybody got off with everything they could, but they got off with maybe clothes on their back or the usable weapons, things that might make them serviceable. But we already know that Blackbeard took the majority of whatever booty was there, and he has fled the scene. Now, we have had speculations about how long it was visible, because honestly, once it sinks out of sight in 1718, maybe 1719, it is out of people's minds. And it's not even included on, the graveyard of the Atlantic map, because it wasn't even known about until 1996, where it actually went down and was found. So with the wind and the surf and everything going on, it took a little while for it. It rolled over on its side, and it's tattered. And we could not determine, and still can't determine, if there was any salvage going on from the town. It's likely that it wasn't even accessible to be salvaged. But we haven't any hard evidence that they didn't come out and try to get something off of it. But pretty much what we find is what went down that day. And again, that's what we're going to focus on. So here's a artist illustration of the marooning of the crew. A lot of very angry and irritated sailors who had been loyal to him. Those who are captured eventually are not so loyal, and basically give testimony that, he stole everything and he left them marooned and abandoned. And some of them, again, there's Lindley Butler, historian, made a lot of research into those that sort of fissioned into the inlands and, became farmers or settlers. Other people have researched this. They were useful men with weapons and they knew how to use them. All right, so fast forwarding again, we know that Blackbeard is moving in and out of Edenton. He's got, he's doing some raiding, even though he did obtain a pardon. He continues to do piracy, and eventually the governor of South Carolina, Spotswood, South Carolina. It's an international raid. He sends Lieutenant Robert Maynard with the Royal Navy on a hunt to find him and take him out. They're done with this. They want to put an end to this raiding. And so that story is fairly famous, how it went down in Ocracoke. Actually, Maynard's ship got grounded too, but they managed to get it off the sandbar. So these are the people who died on the site, died in the battle with Lieutenant Maynard. Was of course Teach, and we know what happened to him. His gunner, his boatswain, his carpenter, a quartermaster, common sailors, and the others are common sailors. The remaining crew members were captured and tried for piracy. Some were pardoned. In fact, his five crew members, including Caesar, his bodyguard, they were all pardoned. Okay, so we're moving to our close examination now of this shipwreck. So as we said, it was discovered by a salvage company, Intersol, in 1996, who had a permit from the state, and they were actually looking for the El Salvador. They weren't really looking for Queen Anne's Revenge, but they did some underground radar and came up with some pretty solid signals that indicated a mound of solid iron, i.e. cannon, and some other things. They brought up the bell, they brought up a blunderbuss. So from these few items that first came up, and they took them to the state to show them what they found, they could determine that yes, this was an early 18th century shipwreck. So fast forwarding that, it's in very shallow water, 23 feet of water. What's left of it is there. And we have some great illustrations in the book of the history of the inlet, shrinking and swelling, and the factors that included, dredging in the area, and how the ship's remains are so minimal in that way, the wooden part of it. So it became a state project, and since 1996, almost annually, sometimes biannually, up until 2016, there were active excavations on the site. Other things had to happen, like when you're bringing artifacts up out of seawater, you must immediately apply conservation methods, or they will crumble and just become rubble. So getting laboratory space in place for big excavations took a few years and some coordination, and that has happened. And that is what is still ongoing, is the laboratory work. But since 2016, there's been kind of a hiatus on active excavation of the site. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens to the conservation, how these things come out of water, and what you must do immediately to preserve these artifacts. And this particular project is a really collaborative effort, not only when we were working on laboratory analysis and all the specialists, international specialists who would weigh in and help identify something, or do wood analysis or ballast analysis, or the zooarchaeology analysis. I mean, from all over the place. You just mentioned Blackbeard, and they're pretty much willing to help you with this if they can. But you have to also get artifacts stabilized before you can really do analysis on them most of the time. So this is just, again, I want to briefly touch on the recovery process, how divers worked off the deck of the shell point. What you see is a sluice box. So they are, as we would throw a shovel on land into a screen here, they are using a suction to suction up each unit. The site is gridded out, and units are excavated by unit with mapping controls. And then using a 3-inch dredge, so it's run through the sluice on the bottom left, and you get various grades of artifacts coming here. And then the rest of that material is fine sluiced in control environment in the lab. Big items you can tag and bring up. They go immediately into holding tanks, either on the deck of the recovery vessel or right there on shoreside. Big artifacts like that anchor, that usually requires another ship with a hoist to get them up. And then immediately, again, they have to be wrapped in wet towels. And then on the other end of that, you have to have a tank ready to receive that large artifact. Okay, so this is an artist rendering, an early one. It's from the Charlotte Observer, but it gives you an idea, again, of the shallow nature of the wreck. And if you can see, here's the outline of the ship. So remember, it was headed inward. So the bow of the ship would be inward, inland, and the stern end would be on the ocean side. So here's the stern end here, and I'm showing you this. And here's the, sorry, I said that wrong. Here's the nose end, here's the bow end. Here's the stern end back here. Now, excavations, when you see the site map in a minute, have started from the stern end working towards shore. And again, as I say, it's only about 60% excavated. But obviously, large things stood up pretty much so, they could be mapped and you could see them. And again, it rolled over on its side. So we had some cannon that we know, cannon tubes that were in the hold, and they shifted. And then we had cannon that were mounted in the gun ports. And so they're roughly paired. So let me keep going. All right, so I showed you the first map to totally confuse you, because this is a flip of that. Okay, so in this one, basically the back end or the left side is the stern end. And there you can see all the gridded out excavation units with everything piece plotted. And that goes up to just past midship. And then that would be the bow end of the ship, which has only been slightly tested, some things mapped, but not excavated. So there's still a third of this shipwreck out there left to do. You know, and taking it apart, as people refer to it, like pickup sticks, you know, taking this up, taking the big cannon up, picking up the ballast, picking up, these are cast coops here, these round things. You see it, oops, you see a little bit of wood there, and that is very little wood, and I'll show you what's left of that, but enough to determine the whole planking pattern, which also told us it was a French ship, and a stern post that showed us it's measured in French feet. So all of these lines of evidence helping us, yes, this is La Concorde, and yes, we're going to find international artifacts on this shipwreck. And remember, I said he wanted to augment the cannon. The eyewitness account said he had up to 40 cannon, big and small. So 29 have been recovered, 29 iron. And I think one or two others now, we're up to probably 31, and then one brass or bronze signaling gun. All right, so now these are the steps of conservation. Again, this has to happen. You must do this, all of these steps or most of these steps, in order to stabilize the artifacts. And that is a full-time, year-round job for some very dedicated people and some graduate students from ECU who do internships there. These are remarkable professionals. So as what happens in the ocean in this environment, if it's not an individual piece, but sometimes even if it is, like the cannon, if it's just a clump of stuff, it's a concretion, you know, that's nature kind of clumping everything together, and you can't really see what's in that concretion. So one way to prioritize how to break down the concretions, and all of those concretions are in saltwater tanks, by the way, was to come up with this idea to X-ray them, to look inside those clumps of whatever, and then prioritize them so that they could then begin to break them down and see what the artifacts were that were held within there. And it also helps them in how to take that down. The object on the right is an X-ray of a ship's jack, and the other is a shackle. All right, then the breaking down of the concretions, and that's a arduous process. It's a dirty process. It's time consuming. You have to wear all kinds of PPE to do this. And it takes a long time because you want to be super, super careful. You can see that cluster on the right. You can see that there's cannonball and there's big and small artifact spreading calipers. So you want to get everything out as intact as possible. At the same time, desalination is going on. And that's important to remove the salt waters from these artifacts. And it's a gradual process that allows them to eventually get into sequential clean baths for stabilization. Finally, if it's artifacts that are necessary, step is bulking and consolidation. That's what you see happening to the cannon here. So they use something like a PEG solution to fill in pits, and then they coat it, you know, kind of smooth it out, fill in pits, maybe where things broke off or came off in a certain way. And then they use a seal to protect it so that then it can be manipulated and handled and put on display. Finally, you know, folks like me come along in between some of this. There, again, dozens and dozens of people who have contributed to this project. The lady there, Valerie, who is drawing, she is doing documentation at this stage, and she's doing detailed artist renderings of the artifacts, which sometimes to me are better than the real thing, just the detail they do. And then I'm over there doing some analysis, and what I would do would be over, these years I've been doing it, is to take a few days off from my other job and just go and do 2 days in the lab, and usually they would have things ready for me to look at that were stable. And I just, would go through analysis sheets. I would bring my little portable library with me. And it, as Catherine said, started with ceramics, graduated to bottle glass, beads, pipes, all sorts of other artifacts. Not so much the nautical for me. I had to learn that stuff because I'm not a nautical person, but mostly it was a collaborative effort. And finally, the last part is dry storage and museum transfer, so that the public, I mean, this really is a public project, so that the public can enjoy the story and these artifacts for real. And it must be in climate control conditions. All right, so take a sip of water with my morning grog cup here. Thank you. So one of the things that Mark and I, when we started down this book project, was to then collectively begin to look at the global origins of artifacts we were finding. And this addresses global markets, and this addresses consumers' preferences, those who had preferences and could make a choice. So we kind of know who is asking for what. Of course, now when you're a pirate, you steal whatever you can. That procurement method is pretty wide open for whatever you want, you take. But what was on the ships that they were encountering was related to consumer choices being made at eventually what would have been the port of destiny. So we started splitting this out, what we could identify. And you can see we got English, French, Swedish, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, Chinese, and African. We have this many countries represented in this artifact assemblage. And why is because, as we talk about in the ceramics and foodways book, is because these might have been the manufacturing centers at that time of those particular products. So you can see representative in the total assemblage of what we could identify, 31% were French and 36% were English. And that's not too much of a surprise. So we're going to look at that more carefully now. All right, here is the quick breakdown by country, and you can just scan the categories there. We even stuff from the Netherlands, which of course would be glass bead manufacturing. Couple of pipes, we think, and one signaling cannon. You can see the 3 Spanish reals that we have came from minted in Mexico. We have a teapot lid from China. We have, of course, African artifacts, but they are something of a whisper of what could have been there and may have gotten off, been taken off with enslaved Africans. Equally French, equally British types of artifacts. Again, what's going east and what's going west. Now, when we tried to do what we call a medium date of manufacturing for all of these things that we had ranges for, it worked pretty well for some things. With some things had a specific date, like a piece of Carnation glass, and a few cannon have dated dates on them, but some were ranges. So long story short, we do the seriation, we come out with the date of 1708. Many archaeologists have used this kind of dating technique, and it is before the incident. So we felt fairly comfortable. Again, our assemblage is telling us what ship this is. Okay, this is fun stuff. This is super cool fun stuff. So as Mark and I began to put the book together, we wanted some action moments in it. We had lots of artifact shots. We've got, some historic maps and records like that, but we really wanted to what we call contextualize the artifacts. So we wanted to group the artifacts, and this is totally our imagination. We weren't there, but we can sort of put this together with research, if you will, looking at other examples, so that we can look at, say, here are the stern windows in the captain's quarter. Here's the keg tap. Here's some of his pistols. Here's his shoe buckles. Here's some of the glassware, and he's having an argument with the quartermaster about, what else, the booty. And over in the bunk on the side over there, recovering from an injury, is his boatmate, his shipmate. That would be Stede Bonnet. And we know Stede Bonnet was an avid reader. Books were on his ship. He preferred that. So we have him reading. We have him in repose. And even after the book came out, by golly gosh, they find a paper wad in one of those breech blocks, and it's from a book of this period. We don't know if it was Stede's book or not, but it was just cool to find paper, and there's a whole story about that. So this is contextualizing some of these things we're going to drill down on here now. All right, grouping artifacts by functional groups. That's like, bread and butter for archaeologists. So ship's elements are what I started with. And again, not being a nautical person, I had some help with all this. But the parts of the ship that we could find actually had carved draft marks that you can see here. And once those were measured out, we realized that, yes, indeed, those were the measurement for a French foot and not an English foot, which would be 12 inches. Again, more verification, plus the Trinell planking pattern that this was built in France. Other types of built-in things. These are bullseye glass. Now, at first, people thought these might have been the base of some large, case gens. Well, they're not. They're they're not, she says. They're clipped on the side and specifically measured to go in lead taming, like this window you see on the left. And these would have been illumination in the captain's quarters in the stern, which is where they're found. We also, I just said, invented in Rouen, but we know the source of this blue-green glass. Other types of fixtures related to the ship would have been some hanging lamp fixtures. These are gimbal lamps, and they're intended to be used on ships. They sway with the ship. They're usually filled with some kind of oil. You can see the one on the bottom there that is actually from Saint Etienne, which was a model that we found in a museum. Now, when I say this, what we're focusing on is this small cockerel right here, this small little finial. And other people have suggested it could be part of a weight set. We just found this very, very similar piece that would actually help to hold the lamp, hold the wick, and it was ornamental. And cockerels in French culture are pretty Spanish, are pretty symbolic for the Gauls, the Gallus species. So we can never really say. This actually came up in the sluice box when I was working there one day. So that made my day. All right, other besides ship's lighting that you have, and we have some other pieces of what we think are lantern or lanthorn, really thin kind of horn pieces. So that's also mentioned in the book. The built-in galley stove. So we have these large brick tile fragments that we coming out. We know the galley stove would have been on the second deck. We think it looked something maybe like this. This is a depiction, and it's brick with a big cauldron, might have had a spit over it as well, and then lined with wood for stability and protection. Okay, so arms and armament. And as I said, we had 29, when we put this together, kind of 29, I think there's 2 more now. These have been identified where possible to the origin. This is a Swedish 6-pounder. And of course, the cannon description is based on the size of the shot that is fired from it. Here is the date range for that one, also falling within our pre-1718. The bottom is an English origin, 1690 to 1715. Many of these are on display now also. Okay, special kinds of things associated with cannon. And there were a lot of cannon. There were a lot of cannoneers, cannon teams. I believe Karen mentioned they work in groups of 6, including the powder monkey. So lots of equipage related to firing the cannon. Some unusual equipage that a graduate student was interested in doing her thesis on this, Kate, were these sheets of lead that were identified as cannon apron. Now they're tied to the cannon with a leather tie. You can see the two holes on each side. Some of them have these little finger edges on the end, and they laid over the touch hole to keep the touch hole dry, so that, you know, you got splashing and stuff, and you got waves coming in through the gun port. So to keep your powder dry, which is critical, there would be these soft pieces of lead covering those. What Kate discovered as she really got down into it and started describing them, on the left, you will see that because lead is soft, they become rather convenient doodle pads, if you will, doodling pads for, you know, the cannoneers who are stationed by their cannon. And maybe they have some time on their hands there between engagements. So once she started looking, it was more than just doodling. It was very specific doodling. And her thesis basically goes to these types of marks, which are called apotropaic marks. And you often find them on thresholds of doors, doorways, maybe windows, mantles and fireplaces throughout Europe. And they're very specific symbols that ward off evil spirits. Some of them are for the, Mother Mary. That rockering stuff is called rigor. But her thesis is excellent, and we mentioned it in the book as well. There's a lot to be said for what these gunneneer people were doing here. All right, other types of tools related to the gunners were, of course, what they needed to measure their shot, spherical calibers. And here I'm going to pause a moment. And remember, I said that Blackbeard in his HMS career got a promotion, was noted for his mathematics, this proclivity to mathematics. And one of the types of artifacts, the category of artifacts that we find so many of, an unusual amount of, are navigational implements like this, like he's collecting them or something. So more than any one cartographer would need, or a caliper or a gunner, he has many on this shipwreck, and it seems as if he's collecting them. So you see the dense concretion I showed earlier, which shows for cranium, if you've ever had physical anthropology. Okay, so this is we're going to weapons now, other weapons, moving away from cannon. These are implements that the crew members would have used, and of course the pirates. And this is, the top is a French hanger. It's a short sword. They preferred short swords because of just the constriction of space. This particular one has the bolster end is cherubs and diamonds and fleur-de-lis, like you see here. And we've had some debate on this. It also has a staghorn handle. And this staghorn handle with a fleur-de-lis was also found together. I have documented them from colleagues who've worked on French marine sites where this same small butt plate is located, the butt plate off of a sword. The other implement on the bottom is called a quillon, or a knuckle guard. And again, it's cast and hand carved, very unique, not likely to find another one just like that. And our hypothesis was that this was possibly Louis XV, who was the child. He became king when he was 5, called Louis the Beloved. But it's a monarch figure with, a draped bust and hand carved, different on each side. Whether or not these two pieces go directly together, we can never be sure, but they were found in close proximity. Another bladed weapon is possibly this, and it's actually made of European boxwood. So we had another specialist do that for us, and it's pewter. And this recently, we thought it might be French because of the little things that look like ermine symbols from the flag of Nantes, but now it could also be Danish. So we have found similar examples coming to us from colleagues that show that it is perhaps Danish. So that's pretty exciting. Research continues. Okay, other small weapons, pistols. And one thing we noted, he kidnapped a gunsmith and he also had a gunsmith. But the parts that we find that came up with the ship so far out of the assemblage are all basically pieces and parts of recycled things. They're not even, the top quality working kind of machinery. So these are datable to British. We can see that's the side of it, 1700, 1720. And this is a trade fusel. This is a serpentine side plate. So again, the pieces and parts are sort of falling into our datable pattern. All right, other things that they would not only stab and shoot you with, but they would throw at you would be these grenades. And it's kind of fun to think about these because they filled them, with gunpowder, and then they would have to get close enough to lob it onto the deck of the ship they were going to board. And so if they picked it up and lobbed it back, then it was just like in the cartoons and you were in a lot of trouble. So you had to time that fuse just right to have impact on the ship you wanted to board. And then you can see at the bottom, thousands and thousands of Rupert shot predominate, but all other different size scatter shot. They were doing buck and ball. They were doing big and small shots and all kinds of other kind of nasty things like range and all that. Okay, so this is the small signaling gun. And this is bronze. It's been inspected by one of our experts. They date it to 1699. We kind of wonder why they didn't take this, but it is fairly worn. And that was some of the discussion about the description. So we think it was probably used as a signaling or saluting gun, but it is a rail-mounted gun. And we haven't found any other rail-mounted guns. So if there's only 29, let's say 30 cannon, we know that maybe some of the other 10 that are missing were rail guns, small enough to get off and take. So other types of bronze, and you see here's another assemblage of different types of spreading calipers or dividers used for mapping. And these have all been treated. You've got just spreading in different kinds, bow ends, but these would have been used for a variety of purposes for cartography and trajectory. Other kinds of navigational equipment, we've got pieces and parts of a box compass. So this is the one on the left is from Byron's Illustrated Nautical. You can see the box, you can see the gimbal mount, you can see what the rose paper looked like. We have the needle there, and we have some of the gimbal straps that would have held it in place. So we know, obviously, they would have had, that illustration is from the Henrietta Marie by Dave Moore, but we also have these elements found. Other types of various navigational equipment that's more related to land navigation. Here's a whole one on the right. Here's the QAR example, these two. And these are like sight vanes for a circumferencer. Pretty sophisticated stuff. And it also, so these are found on the ship, obviously being shipped to some colony or for land navigation. You can see the woodblock illustration there. Here's another one. These are, I've got some credits there of where they're from, missing the wooden tripod, but this on the left is the universal mount, and we do have all the parts of that. So we've got all of these elements. It's broken apart here for cleaning, but that is a universal element along with some additional thumb screws. So these were, again, with mapping equipment. In tandem with circumferenters, and this is definitely a land measuring tool, we had elements of a gunter's chain, maybe two of them. But what we're finding, you see a whole one here. I believe there's one in the Charleston Museum I photographed when I visited Martha. But you can see they were iron, and they're in 66-foot-long sections, each, yeah, that's right, 66 feet long, and the tallies for each of them are in brass. So you would have a one link, a 2 link, a 3 link, or that was an 8. So we're getting all of those cleaned up, and they have epoxied, and we're able to say some of the chaining. And they would come stored in bundles like this with these two handles attached with leather. So this is, what George Washington did and lots of other people. In fact, up until the 1800s, things were measured off in chains and later poles. Okay, another contextualizing image done by our artist, Virginia Wright Frisian, is capturing that moment in sick bay. So I'm going to move into the medical stuff here. But these are our two of our three French surgeons. And, they had to deal with everything from toothaches to amputations, to splinters, to, poisoning, wounds, cuts, all of it. So it was a tight quarters. It wasn't well lit. You can see some of the medical equipment there. Again, some of the expendables that we sort of hypothesized what would be there, mixing of the mortar. Oh my goodness, is it 7 o'clock? Okay, we're going to speed drive now. All right, medical equipment. Here is your basic pharmacy symbol, mortar and pestle, also found on the shipwreck, still today. Here are some French equipment pieces. This is the urethral syringe, again, with the French maker's mark on it. So we know that belonged to our surgeons with dates on it. These two pieces at the bottom are part of what would be a pump blister. These were for introducing medicine by way of an enema. Very common in that period, not so common this day, but these were also French. We have one, what we think lastly was used as a lid for a container, but it is a piece of metal also made in France with initials DV, but we think it might have been used as a bleeding bowl, which was also a common practice here. This particular implement here is iron, and this is a cauterizing iron that would have come in a set like you see on the left with a handle. So we put our little handle in there. We thought, well, it could be a handle for the cauterizing set, but that would be to clean the wound and stem the bleeding. Other things that were related to the medical profession there, as well as other goods, as saying, would have been nested weights. And we have several sets of nested weights, all collapsing, this whole set here from Maidstone collapsing one into the other with a little hinge, fits in your pocket, great for tight spaces and great for measuring. This one has the customs mark of Montpellier on it. Other types of ceramics that were related to the galley pots and medicine were these ointment jars, two on piece on the left, just a whole example on the right. Food and drink. Okay, moving quickly to food and drink. This is several fragments. We have like 90 fragments now of one very large jar, which is an Italian old jar, like glazed on the inside. We did chemical analysis of that, assured scatter the entire debris field. So we know it's all in one pot that was used probably as a cistern. Make of origin, likely to be Italian, and one similar one was found on the La Dauphine. Here are the cardboard boxes of the day. These are olive jars, unglazed inside and outside, coarse made, made in different styles, different ways. This one was typed by using Goggins and Markins. And so it would have had perhaps a small orifice, again, used to store all kinds of things after the original contents were expended. Oh, and so where did we say those are from? Those we say are from, oops, we've already gone. Okay, German stoneware. So German stoneware is the predominant liquid container or container for liquids that we find. Most of these we think are from Siegburg, Germany, because that was who's cranking them out at the time. And we have several different large type of stoneware jugs. Okay, one tiny fragment of a teapot lid, King's teapot lid, again, 1762, 1722, 1662, 1722. And we only have just a tiny fragment so far of the lid. So someone was partaking of ritual tea drinking. These are French ceramics. You see a replica set at the bottom. these are Santonge ware, very specifically French made, 1700, 1750 from the Santon region. The green is caused by copper oxides added to it. And we also find these on land sites of French colonial origin, Quebec and Beaumobile. Now, we had another, the conservator, Sarah Watkins Kinney did a detailed study of all of the plates and dishes. There's an extraordinary amount of pewter plates and dishes here. And miraculously, many of them have readable maker's marks. So she did, again, another study on this, and they all fall within, pre-1718 dates. And this is because pewtering was, they were using guild marks and a guild system at that time. Thanks for us. These handmade kind of spoons, pewter spoons, are not marked. And the one on the top was sort of modified to be a scoop. It was found with some gunpowder and shot. We think it was used to load a weapon. The one at the bottom is classic Hanoverian style spoons. We use these today with the little tip on it. And remember, the House of Hanover takes over when the Queen dies with George I. Come back to that. Right here, we'll come back to that. So these are some really fine drinking vessels. We have 3 or 4 pieces of stemware. This one was the most exciting for me anyway, the top one, because it wasn't, it was basically in a mold. It was molded and embossed with crowns and little bees. And this is actually a piece of coronation glassware, stemware to mark coronation of George I, 1714. What's it doing on the ship? They're having a good time with it. And he's probably smashed it after he took a drink from it. Yeah, he did not like George. The others are lovely blown short stem wares with annular knops. And Museum of London had some great pieces for comparative study. Whole wine bottles, miraculously rolling amongst the cannon down on the ocean floor, were 3 whole wine bottles. These are all English and were all datable as well. And they also have to be conserved, but they fall in that range, 1690 to 1710. Another type of drinking vessel, and this could have had a variety of liquids in it, are these French case bottles. Maybe not gins, maybe tonics. We found hundreds and hundreds of these fragments. Here's what they look like whole. We know where they're made in France. The same glass houses that make the windows in the stern, where the glass is a blue-green color. Again, found on land sites. And we have also historical records that they were using these like Molotov cocktails. They were putting, flammables in there, lighting it, and winging those over the bow. Cook pots. So the 2 cook pots on the top, one is a Derby pot, which we know is patented, that style 1707. The other one is 2/4 of what's a French pot. You see that at the bottom from the Trudeau site. And then all we have of these brass kettles are the ears and the rivets. But we know they were cooking communal meals to also feed the enslaved Africans on board. So personal gear. We have not a whole lot of pipes, but we have some pipes, and the majority of them do not appear to be used. So we're referring back to Jerome Handler's concepts that pipes were often offered to slave men and boys as incentives, and beads were offered to enslaved women as pastime, or we can't say that for sure, but we just suggest that that's a possibility while these are here. And if they were used, we would like to found some more that were used. This is another unique personal item that was a surprise to find. This is part of a pocket watch that came off the ship. And you can see it's particularly just that the balance, this lacy piece, very small, just the balance, pre-balanced verge of a Fusée pocket watch. Again, we had a person working on this and who contacted the Museum of London, found pocket watch specialists who were able to provide some examples. Okay, clothing items. We already have stated that the pirates really loved to steal clothing off of other people. That was how they shopped when they couldn't go to port. So we have a variety of fasteners to highlight, some wooden, some that may have had metal threads around them. That was passerie was a cottage craft. And then sleeve links, buckles. We found 2 buckles of this design that have SB initials on it. And there's been some speculation that those could have been steed bonnets. Shoe buckles, they are of brass, but with silver wash on them. And then others that we are able to date. And rectangular ones, stud shape ones like you see at the bottom, not the silver one, that's just an example, but these and the ones on the top, again, falling in our period. For sewing implements, repairing things, then you couldn't get to port or you couldn't have a prize and steal someone's clothes. A big sail needle, we think that was used for the sail. Lots of safety pins that we know from land sites, those don't change dramatically through the 17th and 18th century. And a pair of scissors, those are actually the epoxy resin replica of those. Adornment. So we had, as I mentioned, we had 126 beads total. The majority of them are this bright yellow, which deteriorates to black. So you see a little bit of that off. We think this was a selection because they probably were associated with the enslaved Africans and that they were gold looking because they were yellow. And then of course we go into a lot of discussion about the other color of glass, the blue and the white and the symbolism of that. And there's more information on that about them being used with females and with rituals worn as belts, referring back to the burials in New York. One pearl, you see a blister pearl there. I think that has to be a tribute to Johnny Depp for some reason. Now, this was interesting stuff. So we know from these comparative studies with the Widow, the shipwreck, the Widow, that crashed the year before, 1717, and it crashed up near Cape Cod in a storm. Almost all souls were lost. But there was a detailed study done on the analysis of that material. And there were a lot of fragmentary African Akan gold beads in that study done, so found on that shipwreck. This was common. You can see the illustration at the bottom and the whole necklace. Those are just examples so that you can compare this lovely woman in regalia wearing gold dust on her face and these Akan beads of some anthropomorphic, zoomorphic lace beads, open lace work. And then this tiny, tiny, tiny fragment that we found with both ends of it clipped. And that's what we saw again and again with this other small ring band that's Rococo, probably French. Both ends are snipped. So the pirates are not concerned about the beauty or the artistry, craftsmanship of this. They're just cutting it by the weight and distributing it. Other artifacts related again to slave trade would of course be the gold dust that they stole. And there's records of how much was on there, some 90 grams or more. We have maybe 20 grams, no, 9,000 grams, and we have about 20 that we've found so far. We now have 6 shackles or fragments of shackles. We had only 2 or 3 when we put the book together, but more have now come out. And again, this book, this has another article about those shackles. The bead on the left is so unique. I get excited just thinking about that. This was looked at, they thought it was wooden. And when I looked at it under a microscope, I could tell that it wasn't wooden and the way it fractured. And so I began again to look at the New York burials from the enslaved burials from New York of this same period, 1690s. And they had a lot of these fine powdered glass beads, where it was a cottage craft. They would crush glass beads and they would make their own beads from it. And then they would use like an agave needle to poke a hole in it. Very unique bead, but obviously associated with the cottage crafts of Ghana, Africa. Okay, and then we found other types of weights. these bottom sets are just there for examples of what if we were to find more, but oftentimes these cases don't survive 300 years of salt water. But the brass and copper weights do. You can see this one is for 8 real. This is for 1 silver real. And this is silver and gold with a little passant lion mark on it, the square one. So we have some good dates for all of those. And again, you know, all sorts of weights were probably being used by a lot of people. These kinds of sets, you know, would fit in your pocket or your private chest to keep for safety. Finally, the queen appears, as we say. This is a coin weight, and this is Queen Anne coin weight. So if you look, her resemblance is facing to the right. When George comes along, any coin or coin weight by him, his likeness is going to be looking the other direction. So the face of the monarch changed in succession. And this is the weight of 1 guinea. It's actually 7.9 grams, cleaned up beautifully. But, you know, you can see she's in this Roman dress. And this is very specifically dated. Okay, I'm running out of steam big time. I've kept you late here. I want to thank my colleague. I want to thank Catherine. And everybody says I talk too fast, and that's all true. And I apologize for that ahead of time. And I want to just, here's some credits for some of the people and the staff at the QAR lab who've helped with all this. Encourage you to please pick up a copy. It's very reasonably priced. It's written in an engaging style, but loaded with footnotes. Okay, thank you for your time.
Oh my gosh, Linda, thank you so much. This is so great. You know, when you're working on a project for as long as this, it's hard to cram everything into an hour. I could listen to you all night. So I guess, you know, that being said, I know we're over time and everything.
Sorry.
I think it's, you know, if you have something like major you want to ask right now, just put it in the chat. But the things that struck me are just how much research has to go into every single object, and how many, talking about collaboration, how much, you know, you have to get experts in this pocket watch, and you have to get experts in this, you know, the cockerel on the, I think it looks like a parrot. Which is more,
good, I like that.
which is more purity, right?
Yeah,
so
okay.
But I mean, all of that research is just amazing. And to think too that there's, you know, on terrestrial archaeology sites, you know, there's some kind of rule of thumb where 1 day in the field means X number of days in the lab, usually like 4 or 5 or something. It seems like with this, it probably is even bigger with that ratio. One day of diving probably ends up being, I don't know how many days in the lab. So I can't even imagine how much work has gone into this. But
yeah. In chapter 5, we talk about the conservation efforts and everything. And there's a chart in there that answers that, Catherine. It'll tell you how many months it takes a particular artifact to be stabilized. Like a cannon, it's 60 months, right. 60 months for a cannon to be stabilized. So it is fascinating. Have
y'all had any interaction with the local Hunley lab here, the Clemson Restoration Institute? Does, you know, they did the Hunley and everything. So I know they're working on some similar, although 19th century metals, and you know, it's different treatments, right, for wood, for metal, for ceramics, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it is. And I'm sure that professional, you know, the QAR lab, those are professional conservators, and I'm sure they get asked to consult sometimes on projects, but then they also collaborate also to learn more. Right. That's what I really like about the project, is just all the collaboration and what we all learn from each other. And it just keeps going. You know, if what we present now, you know, well, maybe that doesn't quite jive, or we found the exact thing, you know, later. That's what research is about. It's awesome. It's just builds on itself. Well, Robert Linkletter asked if there were any news on future excavations. I know it's on hiatus with the underwater. Do they know when that'll get going again? Or
Sorry, Robert. I don't work for the state. I work for Club Med, but I do not know. I haven't heard any plans. I know that they were concerned because if you know that coast, that part of North Carolina, it's got a bullseye on it for hurricanes. So it's often very strong currents and storm systems coming through there. So they do periodically check on the site. And I don't know if their plans right now, it would be, you could ask the QAR directors or the Office of State Archaeology, because that would be who would be funding those excavations to finish it. There's a strong desire to finish it among all the researchers. We want to see what's happening in the bow of this ship. We want to know how that's different from the stern.
That's great. Well, everybody is saying just thank you so much and how fascinating. And so I'll probably let everybody go. I do want to tell you that I'm going to follow up and send out to everybody Linda's list of source material and more information on the book and how you can get it. And we just appreciate you so much, and we hope you come to Charleston. I think there are a lot of guides on this that would love to show you around, and of course I'd love to show you the powder magazine. So thank you so much, Linda. We hope to see you in Charleston.
I'll be there.
Soon. All right.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.